Okay, thanks, Carl. I'm Barb Rosewicz, and good afternoon to you all. My colleague Angela O and I feel really privileged to be talking to such an august group of state fiscal experts on a topic that is really interesting to us as well. And I wanted to comment on your goal of discerning ways to make state budgets more resilient and better weather fiscal uncertainties that come their way, because it really aligns with what the Pew Charitable Trust state work is all about as well. If you're, in case you're not familiar with Pew, let me just quickly tell you that we are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the public interest, and we do research and public policy advocacy on a wide range of topics, most notably for today into state finances. That means that our research takes us into looking at emerging topics. We do 50 state and multi city comparisons, and we try to identify innovative ways the states and localities are addressing some of the complex issues that you also face. Some of our experts also work directly with policymakers or their staffs in trying to come up with solutions and to put them in place. So many of the trends that we're going to talk about today are going to be taken from the resource that Carl mentioned, which is called Fiscal 50, Fiscal 50. This is a free online resource that's available, we hope, for policymakers to be able to get a 50 state look at what's going on across the country. We know that you are the best experts when it comes to your own data, but that doesn't mean that you might always know how your state is doing in comparison with others. You know, you're kicking off this task force at a really dramatic and pivotal time for state finances. So, again, we commend you on that. 1 year ago, this very month, economists were predicting, in fact, that states, as of today, would be dealing with a $200 billion drop in cumulative tax revenue to date because of COVID. And they saw additional deficits on the horizon then for fiscal 22. It was predicted unemployment would be at double digits, and the budget risks were said to be at an all time high. Well, gee, flash forward, and instead the conversation's been turned on its head, hasn't it? So instead of worrying about how to make ends meet in most places, most of the conversation is now that we're having, at least with state fiscal experts today, is often over how they're going to spend this unprecedented surge of federal dollars. Some are calling this money transformational. So, but before we go there and talk about transformational, let's look briefly at where states have been. So, the blue line here is the 50 state trend in state tax revenue during the Great Recession, and then through the long recovery that followed it. Each data point shows how far states were from their peak amount of collections at the outset of the Great Recession. The peak was in 2008 there with the blue line. As you can see, tax revenue plunged as much as 12.5% at one point in 2009 in inflation adjusted dollars. Where that line finally crosses out of the shaded negative territory, what matters there is that it shows us that it took nearly 5 years for the 50 states collectively to get back to their pre recession tax level. At the far right, you can see the effects of COVID, both the fall and what looks like a quick rebound. The important takeaway I think that this illustrates is that the drop in state tax revenue after this recession, the one brought on by coronavirus, does not appear to be as deep as after the Great Recession, and the tax dollars began recovering more quickly. So let's look at the part that's probably most interesting for us right now, which is the change in monthly tax revenue since COVID. This is based on the latest available data that we can get on a 50 state basis. You probably have more current yourselves, but it's hard to get 50 state data. Well, here's the story of total state tax revenue since COVID. As much of the economy shut down to try to stop the spread of the virus, tax dollars fell sharply. Look first at the blue vertical lines. This shows that for the first 4 months, revenue was down compared with the same month a year earlier. But starting in July, and then month after month after month, tax revenue came in somewhat higher than in the year before. Now, April and July are both really exaggerated because of the delay in the income tax filing deadline. So taxes that weren't paid in April got paid in July, and so they look a little out of sorts. But essentially, states lost nearly $78 billion in those first 4 months of the recession compared with the year earlier. And over the next 8 months, they posted consecutive monthly year over year gains of nearly $79 billion, very close. The result was that by February 21, state tax revenue had recovered enough to erase all the losses it had incurred early in the pandemic, though it was just by the smallest of margins. This was a milestone moment, we think. The orange line captures how the cumulative amount of tax revenue was doing at any moment along that line compared with the comparable months before the pandemic. Um, we can go to March because that's our latest data for it's not 50 states, it's really 49 states because Wyoming is missing. But by March, total tax revenue minus Wyoming cumulatively was 0.7% higher than in the months before the pandemic. Okay, now this is only a first milestone, right? Because it basically means that states overall had achieved flat revenue growth, which of course is better than negative. But to really be recovered, tax revenue still needs to outgrow inflation and then to start making up for all of the projected growth that states had counted on but missed out on during this time. Still, it's significant. Instead of facing $200 billion or more in losses, as had been feared, states had reached a break even point, and they had reached this recovery milestone far faster than after either of the two previous recessions. Now, what this total tax revenue trend disguises is another hallmark of this recession, though, which is how disparately state finances have been affected. As you can see, not all states had been able to erase their losses since COVID yet. As of March, cumulative tax collections remained depressed in at least 17 states by as much as 49% below pre-pandemic levels in Alaska, 16% below in Hawaii, 9.6% below in Texas. On the other end of the spectrum, Idaho had the biggest gains of any state, totaling 12.7% more in tax revenue than in those same months before COVID. In fact, it was more than they projected they would take in before the pandemic had hit. Utah and South Dakota also topped this list with the greatest gains. This large degree of difference in how tax revenue has been affected stands out. While some states saw little to no drops in tax revenue compared to FY19, others saw double-digit drops. What accounts for these diverse outcomes? Well, it's largely due to differences in their economies, differences in their tax structures, and differences in the rates of virus transmission and the severity and length of business shutdowns as well. Economically, what this means is that states dependent on leisure and hospitality and on energy saw some of the biggest declines. The oil states in this audience will know that they had already seen declines because of the drop in oil prices before the pandemic even hit. When it comes to tax structures also played a role. States with income taxes, especially those with progressive taxes, benefited from a stock market that zoomed back after it had initially crashed. And they also benefited from something unusual in this recession, which is the fact that hired paid workers were more likely to be able to keep their jobs and to do their jobs from home. So they continued to earn paychecks, spend money, and pay taxes. In addition, thanks to the Supreme Court's Wayfair decision, most states had begun collecting sales taxes on online purchases finally. This was just in time for all of us to burn up the internet with our online shopping. And lastly, there was a big role because of federal assistance. The quick approval of those stimulus checks and enhanced federal unemployment benefits and forgivable loans to businesses put money in people's pockets and into the economy, and spared state tax revenue from a free fall at the outset of all this. Now, the crucial role of federal assistance in helping states sustain the economy and thus state finances can be seen here in the performance of total state tax revenue. Can you see the tail end of this? Okay. So SPI, in case you don't know, it's an economic indicator that's often used by your state revenue forecasters. It basically counts the total pot of all the money that residents take in paychecks, Social Security checks, employer benefits, and any other kind of what are called government transfers, money coming from any form of government. As this blue trend line shows, and I find this really interesting, total SPI, if you will look back to the far left, you will see that it fell in the Great Recession as people had lost their jobs or they had to cut back their hours and they were struggling then with that housing mortgage crisis. But in this recession, total personal income spiked nationally and in every state in the second quarter of 2020. In fact, it spiked at the same time that GDP was going through a record drop. What's really revealing is how this looks when I strip out government dollars from state personal income. So now we're looking at the green line. Does the screen allow you to see what happens at the tail end? All right. The green line plunges at the end, and this is happening because what's left in state personal income then, when you take out all the government dollars, is that earnings plummeted in the second quarter of 2020. And they account usually for the bulk of personal income. In fact, they had record losses that quarter. So every state, as well as nearly every major industry, suffered a decline that quarter as many of the business closed temporarily and workers were laid off. And of course, the national economy was also contracting. So the way these trend lines end up showing what looks like an open jaw at the end dramatically shows the significant role played by that early federal assistance. And it's one of the reasons we attribute to the quicker recovery in tax revenue this recession than in the Great Recession. Angela is now going to talk about another important facet of state fiscal health, and that's state rainy day funds.
Thanks, Barb. So as Barb mentioned, another hallmark of this recession is that states were more prepared than they had ever been for a sudden revenue decline as experienced with COVID-19. So this chart shows the long-term trend in reserves, and it shows that after the two previous recessions, states used their reserves. You can see that by the dips in blue next to the recession bars. So after the Great Recession, states learned the lesson to build and replenish their reserves. So coming into this pandemic recession, states had a record $79 billion on hand in their reserves. In fact, 36 states by the start of fiscal 20 had enough to cover a greater share of operating costs than in the last full budget year before the previous recession. So when the pandemic hit, states had enough money to cover about 29 days worth of operating costs compared to just 17.3 days in fiscal 07 near the Great Recession. And so while there were record amounts of rainy day funds for states, many were cautious about using these funds early on in the first budget year disrupted by COVID-19 due to all the uncertainty. And 15 states tapped $12.4 billion from their rainy day funds in fiscal 20. Some states only withdrew a small portion of these reserves, whereas other states tapped a substantial amount, depending on how large their disruptions were. Still, rainy day funds nationwide were left with the second highest amount ever. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next slide. Barb, can I have you click on the next slide, please?
Yes, it's not letting me advance it. It's not letting me advance it. There we go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this chart here shows the number of days states could run on rainy day funds alone. And if we look to the far right, we'll see Wyoming has the largest rainy day fund, enough to cover almost a year's worth of operating expenses. And next to Wyoming, we have North Dakota and then Alaska. Now, if we shift to that far left, we'll see New Jersey, Nevada, and Illinois. And New Jersey and Nevada had actually drained their savings in fiscal 20, which was a sharp reversal after each had made progress replenishing the rainy day funds that they had emptied during the Great Recession. So some states still have a ways to go to prepare for future downturns. And then if we can, scoot to the next slide. Thank you. So all of the trends that Barb and I have shown so far set the stage for the biggest factor that is now defining state finances, which is the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. So this map shows the $193 billion in ARPA state aid funds as a share of fiscal 20 state spending. The darker blue represents a greater share of spending. And so this map is showing us the magnitude that this money can have on states. Allocations are ranging from 4.9% in Wisconsin all the way to 22.7% in Wyoming. For 37 states, ARPA state aid is equivalent to between 5 and 10% of total spending last fiscal year, which includes capital expenditures and spending from federal funds and bonds. And so this money brings huge opportunities for states, but it also depends on the state. So some states that saw little to no revenue growth can apply these funds differently and maybe a little bit more creatively than a state that had larger revenue gaps that will most likely use a good portion of their money to close those gaps that occurred during the pandemic. But keeping in mind that while this money brings opportunities for states, it also brings potential risks. And this unexpected amount, from what we're hearing, is a lot for many states to think about how to plan and allocate for future years. And so one key thing that we'd like to point out is policymakers need to consider and hopefully avoid that fiscal cliff. And so in this context, a fiscal cliff occurs when non-recurring money is put towards recurring programs or services, or another way is revenues don't align with expenditures over the long term. And so while this money gives many states some breathing room, since they have until 2024 to obligate this money, there is still time for states to think in this long term and plan out this money and make sure that a fiscal cliff won't occur based on recurring and non-recurring patterns. So I will turn it back to Barb to discuss some other fiscal challenges.
Thanks, Angela. So far we've looked at the effects of the recession, the most recent recession on state finances, but it would be remiss to do a whole discussion here of state fiscal health and not get back to those long-term budget challenges that are still lurking below the surface. So even when the dust of this recession has settled, there's still going to be those long-term challenges that several states are going to have to deal with. And I'm going to mention just a couple of them and try to get through them quickly so that there's time for some Q&A. So one of the big ones is, if I can advance here, one of the big ones is Medicaid. And why is it important? Well, because it's a fixed cost and it always looms large in the state budgets because it's the second biggest out-of-pocket expense for states, most states, after K through 12 education. Now, of course, the federal government and states share Medicaid costs, but what we did here is to depict how the portion of Medicaid funds that comes just out of states' own dollars, how that impacts their state budgets. So, for example, so you can understand this, Medicaid expenses in fiscal 2018 accounted for 16.8 cents of every state-generated dollar. And that compares with 14.3 cents in fiscal 2007, just before the Great Recession. So this isn't the latest data available, but I think it's still pertinent because a key takeaway here is that the trend line shows how Medicaid, even before this pandemic, was consuming a greater share of each state-generated dollar than it did way back on the left at the start of the century, and also more than it did before the Great Recession. And of course, this matters because the higher Medicaid costs are, the less flexibility there is to fund other policy priorities, or more demand there is to grow your revenue. Now, importantly, some new statistics just came out this week that found that Medicaid enrollment surged to a record high last year because of COVID. That's counting both Medicaid and the CHIP program. And it found enrollment increased faster after this recession than the previous ones. So I know the federal government has temporarily bumped up the share of Medicaid costs that it's covering, but one day that's going to end. And so this is going to raise questions for states about, hey, what's going to happen to my Medicaid costs once the federal share, once the federal increase in the matching rate ends, and will I still have all those extra enrollees on my in my program? The other one that I want to mention is in aqua is unfunded pension. In green is unfunded retiree healthcare costs, otherwise known as OPEB or other post-employment benefits. And the blue line is net tax supported debt. So Medicaid isn't the only budget pressure that face a number of states. Unfunded pension obligations, unfunded retiree healthcare costs, and debt are all long-term obligations, and I recognize that these are all different, and yet they share one important thing, which is that they all lay a claim to future tax revenue. And so by looking at these as a share of state personal income, we can compare which has the greatest claim on future state revenue. Overall, the takeaway here is that unfunded pension liabilities, the one there at the top in aqua, represents the biggest of these obligations, and it also grew the most over the past decade. There's some later data coming out on that. Pew has actually a group of pension researchers who are soon going to be updating some of this data. But importantly, the ARPA rules do not allow states to use those funds to offset any of these unfunded retirement debts. Importantly, some states are more encumbered by this problem than others. Over at the far right, you have New Jersey, for which this is a major issue. And over at the far left are states like South Dakota and Tennessee and Nebraska, for whom this is far less an issue, if an issue at all. So let me just recap what we've just covered and give a little spin to it maybe, which is, okay, so clearly we're at a point where the economy is on the upswing. States are reporting higher tax revenue. And we're certainly far away from the dark scenarios that we saw a year ago early in the recession. The buzzword today, I'd say, is optimism. But COVID-19 is still circulating in the country and globally, so there's still a note of caution here about whether we're really back to normal yet or not. Among the hallmarks of this recession, and we're still living with the effects of this, is how this recession played out differently than the Great Recession. It hit lower income level people and certain industries harder than others. And that's where you get this so-called K-shaped recovery, because some people are not recovering on the lower end of the spectrum. And it also led to starkly different outcomes in what happened with state revenue. The ARPA funds, for many states, it feels like it's a game changer. It gives them extra breathing room than any of the states had after the Great Recession. But there's still these long-term issues that states are going to have to deal with. Last word to Angela.
So just a couple items on how states can manage uncertainty. So Pew has found some best practices that will help states kind of look toward the future. The first of which is long-term budgeting. So forecasting revenues and expenditures 3 to 5 years out, and then building on that task, using those forecasts as a baseline, stress test budgets under different economic scenarios to understand these outcomes. And given the current climate, some help scenarios could also be included. For example, if there's a resurgence in the virus, what does that do to state tax revenue? And then from there, creating contingency plans based on those stress testing results. And having this long-term view can help states as they just manage normal uncertainty in a business cycle, as well as thinking about using ARPA funds in a way that can bolster state economies, as well as promote long-term fiscal sustainability. And so with that, I believe that's the end of our slides. So we just want to thank you so much for letting us be a part of this presentation today, and we'd be happy to take any questions from the audience.